You consume this, and now you have salt, sugar, fat, all combined together, and that causes the most potent pleasure response in the brain in response to these foods. And now you want more and more. This is why people will consume these types of foods even after they're full. So imagine you're at a
Right.
restaurant
Right. We've all
and
had
you're,
that experience, right? The
yep,
cake comes at the
yep,
end. We're full, but you still eat the cake. So I guess the
yep.
point here is that to connect it back to what we were talking about earlier about insulin, energy storage, hormones, and that stuff, the composition of the food we eat, what we're eating, but also both in terms of like its caloric content, whether it's got fats, carbs, all of these things, but also the speed with which it spikes our blood glucose and affects our hormones. That's going to create a signal in our body that really puts us more in the energy storage mode than the energy mobilization mode. So, the way that we're eating, both sort of the temporal structure that we're eating in, but also the composition of the food are really affecting things like insulin and the hormones and things in ways that completely push us into energy storage mode. Is that fair?
Yes.
And so that's the problem that a lot of people face. That ties into the GLP-1 drugs and why they need to be, 100x roughly more potent than our natural satiety mechanisms and things like that. When we talk about humans and evolutionary history, and we had to go through these periods of feast and famine, one thing that's sort of implied by that is if we're going through a period of food scarcity, we were using our fat storage. We still had to go out and get food as hunter gatherers at some point. So at some point, people had to go out and they had to hunt and they had to get something, which kind of implies that even though they were burning their body fat, even though they may have been in a ketogenic state or something like this, highly fasted, they had to go out and physically perform and perform well. And obviously they must have done that because, we're all here today, the descendants of these people, if we go back far enough. This brings us to the topic of how the body physically performs in terms of muscular contractions, behavior, exercise, and things like this in the sort of the carb versus the fat utilization states. And this is something that you've written about and you know a lot about. I want to start with anecdotes we can probably all relate to here. Everyone living today, I think. I can remember being a kid, and when you were doing things like athletics or you had to play a sport and you had like the game the next day, the advice I always heard from coaches and stuff was carbohydrates are sort of the better fuel source. They're somehow the preferred fuel source. And you should really load up on carbohydrates the night before you're going to do your sports match or you're going to work out or whatever, because that's going to be the best way to fuel maximum performance. And so I want to discuss with you the idea of exercise performance and physical performance with carbohydrates versus fats being in a more ketogenic state versus a carb utilization state. And one thing that was really interesting
So,
is, yeah, go ahead.
oh no, go finish.
I was going to say, what you started out this paper that I read ahead of time, and you had some interesting historical information on this. And you actually said from 1896 to 1996, Olympic athletes preferred protein rich foods. And at the 1960 Olympic Games, carbohydrate based foods were not a catering priority. 16 years later, 1976, the emphasis remained on high intake of protein. And then at some point after that, people started to emphasize carbs more and more. And especially in the context of athletics and high performance physical activity, it really became focused on carbohydrates. So I guess my question for you starting out here is, when we look at this historically, what was going on in the research world that started changing people's minds that got us into this mode of carbohydrates are really important for high performance athletics?